Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I am the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center, and this is a special extended edition of our weekly broadcast to you. Yes, we're going to have our center directors on to talk about the latest of what's happening in Olympia and how it applies to your life, to your business, to your family. But we'll also be joined at the end of the program by Congressman Michael Baumgartner, who took a step down to join Congress, but was once our co-Eastern Washington director. So we're excited to have him join us in his new capacity as congressman, and it'll be your chance to ask questions of him as well. At any point, you can put your questions in the Q&A box there, and it's at the bottom of your screen. Try to avoid using the chat for the Q&A because it's more difficult for me to get to them just based on the studio setup and other things. You can also raise your hand if you want. There might be an opportunity there. But to make sure that if you do have a question, the best way is to use the Q&A box there at the bottom of your screen. We have three center directors joining us toward the end. It will be Mark Harmsworth to talk about some potential tax increases coming our way, rent control, and good news that happened in the legislature, thanks in part to your actions after we alerted to you what was going on. So we'll talk with him toward the end. We also had a bit of good news from Elizabeth New, who will join us in about 15 minutes. We'll talk with her about her experience meeting with Governor Ferguson's team. WPC has been asked, one of the things that we strive to be is nonpartisan because good policy doesn't have to have a party, right? You can present good policy and encourage people from either party to embrace it. And so we're excited about this opportunity to meet. So we'll talk with her about what happened and what she emphasized and how it came about. But first, we're going to start with Pam Lewison. She is our agriculture director, as you probably know, and she's been very prominent in the field. And Pam, you have another a title these days. Is it the president of the Cattlewomen's Association, or what am I getting that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I am the president for the state for the Washington Cattlemen's Association.
Yeah, some people have, you should say that in the cowboy way, like super proud. Some people have people who research agriculture and what farmers do, and we have a farmer that researches and tells us what farmers do based on experience and research. So it's great to have you on to kick off the program today. Let's start with the 5117, the bill that would have provided a fiscal note to any ag policy bill and would have showed what was your hope that it would do and what happened to it.
So 5117 was a teeny little bill, actually, that was only 3 pages, which is really short for a bill here. And it would have basically made our legislature pump the brakes a little bit on new policy that came through the legislature and ask them to think about, what is this legislation potentially going to do to our farms and ranches moving forward. So it would have asked for a fiscal note. What impact is this going to have financially on our farm community? And the cost of it was really minuscule. $246,000 this legislative session, and then an ongoing cost of just $113,000 for the next couple of bienniums after that. So in the grander scheme of things, something that those of us who follow policy would call budget dust in the grander scheme of things. Unfortunately, it did not make it out of Senate Ways and Means this session, which is really unfortunate because it was really meant to be a protectionary measure for one of the largest economic pillars in our state.
So, basically what you're saying is that the cost of this would have essentially been legislative staff coming up with the analysis of the bill and providing what it was, what impact it would have in the ag community, right?
Yeah, and I think everyone's really held up on this budget crisis in particular in our state, and I think it's wise for us to find ways to cut expenses. We can all certainly empathize with where people are budgetarily, both on a personal level and on the state level. But I do think that in this instance, we are also in a very serious situation in Washington state where we are losing farms at a rapid pace, 2 farms a day every day between 2017 and 2022. We don't see that slowing down. In fact, there is the possibility that that may remain stagnant, where we are continuing to lose that number of farms every day as we move forward. And so this bill is really looking at ways to um, figure out if the regulatory burden as we look at these bills is part of the problem. Is the cost too high for our farms to continue to function?
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that pace that you just made a reference to over that 5-year period is about twice the pace of the previous 10-year period. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Actually, a little bit more than that.
Okay.
In the previous 10-year period, we were losing about 14 farms a month versus 2 farms a day. So it's a significant increase.
This is probably one of these questions that people who don't follow the legislature, they hear about something like this. It's one of those things where you've got to be sitting back and saying, okay, it doesn't cost, any statistically speaking, any additional money to do this. It seems like a good idea to alert people and get people thinking about what the cost would be to this top 3 sector of the state economy, agriculture. People think high tech all the time, but ag, but last I checked, it was 2. Is it still 2? Do you know, or is it goes between 2 and 3? Well, either way. But the point is, it seems like this would be a no-brainer kind of a bill. Why does a good idea go to the legislature to die then? What was it that killed it? Why would there be opposition?
I think a lot of it is really a knowledge gap. This isn't, I think farmers are really quick to say, well, it's because legislators hate us. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think, maybe sometimes, but I think a lot of it really is legislators not really understanding what it is farms do or don't do, and what sort of control farmers and ranchers have or don't have over their overall finances and how the economy functions, both in the short and long term.
What about there are other areas of farming that people have been following with you this legislative session. One of them was, for example, another no-brainer kind of idea was, hey, Washington is one of only 2 states that has a sales tax on farm vehicles as though they're other consumer vehicles. It adds tens of thousands of dollars or $100,000 in some cases to a new piece of farm equipment. And we're one of only 2 states that keeps that kind of punitive tax on farm equipment. Let's get rid of that. Surely that has made some movement in the legislative session.
The bill was filed, a hearing was had, and then it didn't move any further, unfortunately. And I do think it is another one where it had great broad support in the community. It had support even amongst our equipment dealers who were very interested in seeing that sales tax removal, because ultimately it has the potential to spur the purchase of more equipment, something that we've seen stagnate over the last year or 2 in, a kind of out in the world. And yet, we have our um, legislative community looking at that and saying, "Oh, well, that's less money in our pocket." So this one is for sure not going to move forward.
Yeah, when you think of how many farms are disappearing, the less money in your pocket thing, it seems short-sighted because not all things stay the same, right? I mean, if more farms disappear, fewer people buying the equipment, you're actually going to end up with less money one way or the other. So you might as well keep that economic engine healthy, would be my thinking. But then again, neither you nor I are in the legislature, so sadly. We also have talked about the importance of gray wolves. This is kind of a strange topic for a lot of people, especially west of the Cascades, although less so now that there's the talk of grizzly reintroduction that seems to have sparked some awareness to what some predatory animals with dangers they might bring. But gray wolves have been a serious problem, especially in northeastern Washington, where their numbers are well beyond what was originally said would be required to reintroduce the species. What kinds of management bills are going through the legislature, and is there any indication that there will be a better policy moving forward after this session?
So there were several bills around gray wolf management and compensation for things like intangible losses, which I'll get into in a minute, um, and making sure that we are putting more money in the coffers for the wolf and livestock depredation account that deals specifically with depredations in Northeast Washington. It was a remarkable number of bills that were filed this session. I think the count was right around 8 to 10. Most of those bills did not make it past cutoff, but a couple of them did. The ones that I want to really sort of talk about are the intangible loss bills because they address a really specific issue around gray wolves and gray wolf management. And I also want to touch on local management because it is a policy idea that Todd Myers and I put forth a couple of years ago. If you go back to last legislative session, at the tail end of session, Kathy McKay, who runs K Diamond K Guest Ranch up in Northeast Washington, gave some really moving testimony about the really tragic events that are occurring on her ranch. And they're not isolated to her ranch, but she was willing to come and testify and talk about how gray wolves have really haunted their ranch and have significantly injured their ability not only to function as ranchers, but also for them to operate their guest ranch. And so this session, local management became a topic of discussion for, I think, really the first time ever in a bill format. And what was proposed was, hey, as we see gray wolves sort of settle into an area and they're clearly not going to go anywhere, we need to consider calling gray wolves recovered in that area so that local management can be the order of the day. And folks who live in that area, in conjunction with the State Department of Fish and Wildlife, can figure out how to better address the needs of local people and manage those wolves on a local level. So that people like Kathy are not having to wake up and see carcasses of cattle and horses in their yard. Um,
I've stayed at her ranch before. It was a great, wonderful place, and she works extremely hard making her living at that ranch, and seems to always be working and always be focused on making that ranch work, and it's really impressive. And I just don't think people have any concept. Even when I visited the zoo to see wolves, they are just so small compared to going out there and seeing a wolf that's just been spending some quality time chasing, elk and deer and things. I've seen one up close and personal, and they are just an incredible creature. And you can see very quickly why too many would be a serious problem really quick, really fast.
and
So
I do think the intangible loss bills really tried to address that. There was some testimony that I take issue with that was heard during some of those hearings. Intangible losses is a real thing. There is a lot of data, there's a lot of research around the fact that animals don't have to be eaten by a wolf to be impacted by it. The near existence of a wolf pack within smelling distance of a cattle herd um, absolutely changes their behavior and it actually changes their body biology. So it does things like um, interfere with their ability to gain weight, interfere with their ability to get pregnant. It also increases the incidences of calves being stillborn. And it also has the potential to increase the ability of things like failure to thrive in calves, which effectively means that a calf is born sick and it has the potential to die as a baby. There's a lot of data that supports this. And so creating a system of intangible loss, um, sort of compensation for ranchers who are not going to get any help any other way allows those folks the opportunity to recoup expenses for having to live with gray wolves as neighbors through no fault of their own.
Yeah. We had a question online. Are these gray wolves natives to the Pacific Northwest, or are they Canadian gray wolves?
So I think it depends on who you ask. Effectively, what happened is that a couple of gray wolves were identified as having come back into the state in 2017. Contrary to popular belief, they were not brought here. They just showed up. And since 2007, I think it's 2017, since 2007, these wolves have been sort of naturally propagating in the state. So we've had them here since 2007. And we have gone from that initial identification of wolves in 2007 to now we have, I believe the last count was at least 217, I believe. I'd have to double check my numbers, but a significant number, well over um, the number of breeding pairs necessary to consider wolves recovered. However, it's a two-part recovery requirement. We have to have long-term breeding pairs in the state, and we have to have regional dispersal that occurs naturally. The regional dispersal is the trouble that we're running into. Wolves are staying in sort of the northeast and southeast version of the state, region of the state, excuse me, and they are not really moving anywhere else. And that is posing a real problem for our folks that are in that far eastern region.
Yeah, and I'll just say, based on my own personal experience, hunting in a place where wolves had quote unquote fully recovered that way, I have never seen a place more desolate of wildlife than the wilderness that I was in. That at one point, not too many years ago, was well known for being absolutely filled with elk and deer, bears, cougars, and other animals. And a week out there with other experienced hunters climbing the hillsides and everything else, and seeing, one lone bear track after all that time was really something. I mean, it was sad and eerie. One more question for you, then I have a final question that should leave us with a little bit of good news. If we follow the Calvin Coolidge approach that stopping a bad bill is even better than getting a good one, and that is, are farms being lost? This is from our audience again. Are farms being lost to development or being acquired by larger farms, economy of scale, especially with retirements? I hear of both.
So there are several different um, reasons for the rate of attrition. Um, Farms are being lost to retirement. That's certainly part of it. Farms are also being lost to development. Um, Farms are being bought up by other farms. But when I say farm losses, what I mean is that these farms are no longer functioning as farms. Farms that are being bought up by other farms, so into a consolidation or being sold to another farmer, those are still active farms. So they aren't counted as losses by the USDA. So when I say loss, what I mean is a farm that is effectively no longer exists as a food production source.
Great answer. I guess I lied. There's one more question, wolf related, from the audience. Do you know if wolves consume the animal completely? I'll add, or are they look more like cats, where they just have a hunting instinct and they'll just hunt?
It depends. So in some cases, having seen wolf depredations in person, sometimes there's nothing. Sometimes you're lucky if you find a hoof or a bit of hair from a depredation site. What you'll see is a lot of blood. In other times, I've seen instances where a mother cow had a hole eaten in her side, and the wolf ate the calf out of her and left her to die. So when wolf activists talk about wolves being these mighty and majestic creatures, um, on the one hand, I don't necessarily disagree, but they are also brutal predators who are very interested in feeding themselves. And I think it's important that we find a balance that respects that these ranchers take care of cattle, and their horses and sheep and goats and other animals as their livelihood. And when they come across these sorts of things, they have to live with the vision of that for the rest of their lives.
Well, I don't want to leave you with that horrific image in people's minds. So let's turn to a piece of news that might actually be a little good, and that's the cannabis bill, the bill
Yes.
that would have unionized cannabis workers as ag workers. What's happening? What happened with that, and why were you concerned about it?
This one is an interesting sort of little, what I felt like was a little bit of a testing of the waters. For folks who don't know, cannabis is not considered an ag product in Washington, nor should it be. It is still federally regulated as a drug product. And while states have started to deregulate it, it is still federally illegal to buy cannabis products. The DEA has said, as states have deregulated it, that they are not going to go out and raid every pot shop in every state in the country. Um, However, it is still regulated by the DEA. So um, it posed some gray area questions. So there was a bill that would have, first of all, moved the governance of cannabis into the under the auspices of the Washington Department of Agriculture. That bill has died. The second part of this two-pronged approach would have unionized cannabis workers as farm workers. We have a very small number of cannabis workers in this state who this would have affected. A really teeny number. I think the math that I did earlier this session was less than 1% of our total farm worker population. Um, and that in turn would have opened the door to open a larger can of worms about unionizing all farm workers under state regulation. The trouble with this kind of legislation is, as we've seen with ag overtime and other bills, while it's a well-meaning bill to begin with, it does not take into account, going back to our original topic at the beginning, things like how the agricultural economy works and whether or not farmers actually have the ability to absorb the kind of costs that would be introduced in this kind of um, activity. And that's where you go back to having bills like 5117 that need to be passed to make sure that farms can actually um, absorb those kinds of operational costs. So I'm happy to report that both of those bills died in committee with policy cutoff because it is, even though they are dead bills, it is a ray of sunshine for the agricultural community to be able to push back a little bit and say, hey, we don't need more enforced regulation and more enforced cost than we already have and are already trying to absorb.
For those interested in more on what Pam's speaking of when it comes to farmers not able to absorb certain costs, you can go to the agricultural section at washingtonpolicy.org and read her Farm Economics 101 piece that was written earlier this year, right there off the tab. Pam, thanks so much for joining Washington Policy on the Go. I know you have other duties today, so I'm going to let you go. And thank you for being here. Now let's we'll bring forward Elizabeth New to talk about her meeting with Governor Ferguson's team. But first, I want to remind you, coming up around 1 o'clock, we'll speak with Congressman Michael Baumgartner. He'll be taking your questions. If you have questions for the congressman that you've thought up in advance, You can share them anytime in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. You can type them in there and put your question in queue at any point in time. All right, Elizabeth, we had 12 years of Governor Inslee, and I am nearly certain, well, I am certain that other than a chance meeting in the hallway, we did not meet with Governor Inslee's team. And here we are in the first days, the opening days of the Ferguson administration, and you are going to his administration to meet with his team. Tell us, how did this happen, and what your experience was like?
All right, so in January, I asked the governor's office for a meeting to discuss potential cost savers I saw in the state in areas of healthcare and worker rights, and to point to concerns I have about union politics in our state. They were super gracious. A couple weeks later, they said, hey, let's meet, and if you watch the inaugural address, the governor was all about saying we need to find cost savers, we need to control our spending better. And so when I saw that, I thought, I want to help. And I went by his office when I was in Olympia and sought this meeting out. So again, a few weeks later, they called me and set me up with two senior advisors who graciously welcomed my input, were interested in cost savers I saw in Medicaid, and they invited me to another meeting with them after the busy legislative session. So it was really encouraging. I think there's a lot of common ground here, at least from the cost saving angle. They also asked me what bills I was looking at this session, and then we talked specifically about Senate Bill 5041, a bill that's been moving along and now has a fishy fiscal note attached to it. The bill would pay striking workers unemployment insurance benefits. Unfortunately, it's moving along. Another bill we discussed was Senate Bill 5258.
When you say, can I pause you there? When you say
Yeah.
disgust to the striking union workers here, what are you pointing out to them? Is this part of your cost savings concerns, or is this more on principles of fairness? Like, the unemployment insurance, it's already really high in the state. Businesses pay a lot for that. And if we'd have had this project going forward when the Boeing workers were on strike, for example, that would have been a major blow to the unemployment insurance fund.
Yeah, look, I'm against this bill principally, right? I don't think employers should have to pay their employees not to work and to strike instead and demand wages or working conditions of various matters. I also think it hurts workers who don't strike and who are then laid off afterward because there isn't money to go around to everyone. Also, this fund could deplete an unemployment insurance fund. And that's where I see the common ground, is the state being concerned, one, about that depletion in the uninsured, the unemployment insurance benefit fund. And the main one I'm concerned about with 5041 right now is the bill that currently exists, or did at least a day or two ago when I checked, still includes the ability for public workers to strike, and those public employers would have to pay back the unemployment insurance fund and do all this navigating around the payment, even if they have to reimburse them payments as we do with teachers, etc. So I think that without a strict prohibition against public employees who are striking, the state's getting in a lot of trouble that it could see cost increases from. So I think they were interested in that part of it. We obviously don't agree in principle, I don't think. I shouldn't say we obviously don't. I don't think we agree in principle. And they in fact asked me, would you be for it if the striking public workers were not allowed this allowance with the unemployed insurance benefits going to them? And I said, no, I'm still against it in principle, but I'm concerned about the cost to the state, to state taxpayers of financing, and I'm concerned about learning loss. If we don't make it very clear to education groups that strikes by public employees are prohibited, we're continuing a bad road for kids in our state, I think.
Even Franklin Roosevelt recognized that public employees operated in a different, different sphere than private industry employees, because, obviously there's a lot of them contribute to the campaigns of the very people that are on the management side. So that's going to be a conflict right there. You don't have the same kind of adversarial relationship between the two. In fact, you often have the people that are supposed to be doing the negotiating putting out prominent statements saying, I stand with the strikers, even though they're supposed to be on the management side representing the taxpayers. So it's a bizarre relationship.
It's always hard to see legislators going to the lines, the picket lines, and being in support of something that's not supposed to be legal in our state. It's crazy. The other thing I pointed out to the governor's team was a fishy fiscal note. I don't know how this happened, but I sat through a hearing where I lost my faith in fiscal notes. Apparently, calculations were used based off of New Jersey experience with strike. That is not our experience with strikes. It did not include large employee strikes like the Boeing one we just saw a few months ago, and like one we'll probably see in the next year. So it just seems like it's been cooked, and I was hopeful that a version of this fiscal note that came along and showed it could be far more detrimental than other fiscal note works have shown didn't survive. Instead, we got this watered down fiscal note that shows, it's not going to be a big deal.
It's funny how even fiscal analysis can be manipulated. I always refer back to my favorite political satire program, Yes, Prime Minister. There's a complete episode on how to manipulate statistics to get them to say what you want. And that's what it sounds like is happening here as well. Before I let you go on the Ferguson thing, I'll talk to you in more detail about it. We'll have to have a write-up on it in the new Washington Policy Center magazine coming up in about a month or so. But I did want to ask, is there any other piece of legislation that you've been watching and tracking that you feel it's urgent to share with us before I turn to Mark?
There's two other ones that, well, there's a lot I'm concerned with, but two other ones that I brought up to the governor's office were Senate Bill 5258, which concerns some Medicaid savings that could be had that were called out by the state auditor's office. Sadly, that bill had a cost attached to it, fairly small, I think, but it did not survive fiscal committee cutoff. But I'm really hopeful the point was taken that we need to go after just plain Medicaid waste. The state auditor's office found that we were paying double payments to Medicaid patients. So they were getting Medicaid in one state and our state. And there wasn't a way to keep this from happening in an inadequate way. So we were overpaying, I'm not going to remember the number, but it's high. I wrote about it and it's on our website. So I'm hoping that better efficiencies will come to that process. The state auditor's office mentioned some that could happen, and we really need to take charge of that area and stop wasting money that doesn't benefit anyone and just hurts taxpayers. Another one I'm super concerned about is Senate Bill 5292, and I was able to bring that up. It's a way to change the tax rate attached to a payroll tax for the program called Paid Family and Medical Leave. That program is benefiting high income earners more than low income earners. It's not a safety net, and this bill would guarantee that the payroll tax rate increases rather than decreases. So I'm concerned more than about the bill. I'm concerned about just this program in general and why we're continuing to expand safety nets to people who don't need them. The last bill I'll bring up is one that's super concerning because it would House Bill 1123, Senate Bill 5083, those are the pair. It's an agency request proposal, and it appears to be passing. The bills are entitled Ensuring Access to Primary Care, Behavioral Health, and Affordable Hospital Services, but I fear it's going to do nothing of the sort for many of us. It would bring price caps for services provided public employees. So while the state and its thousands of employees might enjoy lower cost of care for a while by reducing state paid reimbursements to providers and hospitals, I think that's going to come at the expense of the rest of the state's residents, commercial insurers, hospitals, and providers. We're picking winners and losers in the healthcare game. And it does nothing to go after cost containment of healthcare services, just the shifting of payment for those healthcare services.
Imagine what would happen if people thought of the laws of economics as actual laws of economics rather than the suggestions of economics. Then they might take a closer look at when they're looking for cost savings, they might be able to find them a little more clearly. Well, I was encouraged by your experience at Governor Ferguson's, not just a meeting, but a meeting at which his team took notes, invited you back. Because it's one thing to take a meeting and not actually listen. We've all been there where somebody's there, they're not even taking notes, they're just sitting through the process. They got, intern Joe to sit with you, and that's it. This sounded much more promising. There's a follow-up, so we'll see what happens. It's the last time I heard of this was Bob Williams, the former gubernatorial candidate and state representative and think tank legend, used to sit with Mike Lowry, the most liberal governor of Washington, and he would sit with him and they would go through what Bob thought could save money, and Lowry would be excited from time to time, thinking, yeah, we could save money, and he wanted to spend it on new programs, whereas Bob wanted to, taxpayer returns, but. Still, it's at least it's a good conversation and leads to some efficiencies. Thanks so much for joining us today on this, and we'll talk with you again soon.
All right. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Mark, getting to you now. Mark, you caused quite a splash earlier this week. You wrote about a bill and revealed a section of a bill that basically nobody seemed to know about, including the sponsors of the bill. It was ostensibly to protect children online, but it included a section that you wrote about that would have mandated a certain action by social media companies. Tell us about that and how you found it.
Yeah, well, so I read the bill. I mean,
whoa,
legislation 101, read the bills you're about to vote on. And I get it. There are a lot of bills that these guys have to take a look at all the time. But no, I just read the bill. And the bill essentially was supposed to regulate the feeds that minors get, not the digging kind, the children kind, on Facebook. And the whole idea is that the sponsors of the bill were focused on they had concerns around these feeds being very targeted, so they become addictive, and they call them addictive social media feeds, where they look at behavioral patterns with people, and we all see it on Facebook and TikTok and all these different places, and they show you stuff that they know will keep you on the feed, and it's that death scroll of doom as you hear about. Well, the other provision in there, particularly to do with minor accounts, was to put a big message on the minor account person's screen saying, hey, mom and dad are watching you at the moment. And obviously that would have exactly the opposite effect, which is now the minor is going to be on their best behavior because mom and dad are watching. So if they're discussing something with somebody in a chat or doing something like this or posting something on a feed, they're not going to do it while mom and dad's watching, obviously. So that was part of the issue. The other issue is, this issue still exists even with the substitute bill that was introduced by Senator Wagner, is the location and the privacy levels. So there's, in both bills, there is an issue with the privacy settings, where the company gets to choose the privacy level unless there is a compelling business reason to change that, but it doesn't define what that is. So that's a little bit of a problem. But the other one is location. So you can imagine a child that maybe has been online talking to somebody, maybe a predator or something like that, and they leave. In the old days, you used to be able to get the location data out of Facebook and these other places, and the parent would have been able to figure out where their kids are. And this is just for phones. This would be if they logged in a house somewhere on a web browser, they'd be able to figure out where the kid was and maybe go rescue them, particularly if it was a kidnapping or something like that. Well, they're still preventing that from being shared with parents. So there's some issues there that still need to be worked on this bill. It's better, definitely better, and we've got a win there as far as, oh my gosh, you can't do this to parents. But we still need to be watching this one and see how it's going to play out.
Well, I know for a fact that a lot of people were alerted, thanks to your earlier work, and that the change in the bill to the first section, where these social media companies were going to have to alert children if parents were watching, and basically tell kids you need to go to a different app or some other service to do the things that you were planning on doing. That changed in part because, in large part because you alerted people, and we sent it out to tens of thousands of people, and then it got coverage on the radio and in other activist groups, and that's fantastic. It's good that they got that quick feedback. I see that Congressman Baumgartner is coming up here, and so I want to real quickly ask you about rent control, because I know you've been following that issue very closely, and we've talked about some of the destructive after effects of rent control. How close are we to a reality of rent control moving forward in this state?
Well, it seems to be it's moving still. I thought it was going to slow down a little bit, but it's back on the cards again. It's sitting in rules and appropriations and some other different bits and pieces in the House and Senate. For those that need the bill number, it's 1217. This puts a cap on rent increases at 7%, and it introduces a whole bunch of penalties if you go over 3% per year, and it will completely destroy the rental market in our state. There's no doubt that the senators and the representatives that are supporting this really haven't done their homework on what it will do. If you're a property owner and your roof goes out on your house and you have to replace it, and you're going to have to recoup that money in an increase in rent, then you're going to want to go over 7%. The result of this bill will be that you will almost guarantee a 7% increase every single year, because a property owner won't want to take the risk that the next year the roof fails, or there's a flood, or there's an insurance incident, or they get a bad renter that turns their house into a pot store or something. So they're going to take that every single year. So the net effect is, if you've been living in a home where you've been a good renter and the landlord has given you breaks on the increases, that's not going to be the case anymore. You're going to see a depletion of stock in our state, which demand and supply will drive up the costs of rent. So an immediate, maybe you'll get a little relief for a couple of years, and then suddenly you'll see rent start going up. So that, in a nutshell, what's at. It could be up for a hearing or a floor vote this week. So please stay on top of this one.
Got a quick question for you from Janice. She writes, my state senator and representative are both Republicans, and they're on board with my positions. I want my views to get to the whole Senate or the whole House or the entire legislature. Is there a way to do that?
Well, I think you can use the legislative hotline to do that. If you reach out, you can say who you want to send the message to. So the state website has that. If you go for the bill information, you can also submit testimony to the committee through that if you know your bill number, and you can get information to them that way as well. Start with the chair of the committees. That's the best way to go.
And I was going to recommend too, if you have friends in other places, call them up and tell them you need to call as well, and let them know what you're thinking, so that it's not just your voice, because obviously a legislator is going to listen to the people in their district the most. That's the loud voice, right? Yeah. People outside of your legislative district are calling you. Those voices are not going to be that loud, no matter.
That is right. Yeah.
Very quickly, I know we're expecting to be joined by Congressman Baumgartner here any minute. I wanted to ask you very quickly about the wealth tax and the B&O tax increase. Was there any of these major taxes, or the sales tax for affordable housing, any of those moving forward, or did we get lucky and are they on the cutting room floor?
Well, it looks like they're on the cutting room floor. The wealth tax didn't even get heard in committee. So, but this is a legislature that does strange things. So, and all indications are is they're dead. But we need to be vigilant and pay attention, because they could be pulled to the floor. It has happened before. They have fiscal components, so they pass that fiscal element until we get past the cutoff for House of Origin. So the utility taxes, giving counties the ability to assess you for utility taxes, a multi-percentage increase on many homes on their taxes and utility fees. The B&O one looks like it's dead. and the affordable housing sales tax also looks like it's dead, and the wealth tax looks like it's dead. But we have to stay vigilant on these things until you get past House of Cutoff. And even then, there's still a small chance.
Yeah, because this is one of those things where, as a legislator yourself, with that experience, that something, just because something's dead to cutoff doesn't mean it's going to stay dead. All right, Mark. Hey, Mark, thanks so much for joining us
You bet.
today. Thank you for that. Now let's turn to Congressman Michael Baumgartner. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us. I would just want to give you a chance to open up and say a few words to our audience here and what it's like to be in DC. And it's just great to have you on the Washington Policy on the Go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sound great.
Well, I think let me start by saying that how much I appreciate Washington Policy Center for all the fantastic work that WPC does for our state. As many of you know, WPC helped me start my legislative career back in 2011. I beat a Democrat in what was then the most expensive legislative race in state history. And the Washington Policy Center Policy Guide was instrumental in me having the facts and policy confidence to go into that tough campaign. You guys are a tremendous resource as we took the Republican majority in the Senate. Seems like a million years ago, but it was as recently as 2017 that free market loving Republicans actually controlled the Washington State Senate. So it is possible to do that again. I was committee chair of Commerce and Labor, and WPC was really a wonderful backstop and resource. And some of you know that I guess that as I've said previously, but receiving the Champion of Freedom Award for Washington Policy Center was really one of the highlights of my legislative career. There's only two things that hang on my wall from my time in the state Senate, and WPC's Champion of Freedom Award is one of those things. So the only bad part of me getting to run for Congress and become a new member of Congress was that my stint as the Eastern Washington director for WPC, co-director with my wife, only lasted about, and Eleanor was definitely the best part of that deal. Let me be clear that you guys missed out modestly with having Michael Baumgartner, but you missed out in a very significant way, not getting more of Eleanor Baumgartner. But obviously WPC remains very close to the Baumgartner's heart, and we're just very pleased to be able to join you today and give you a little insight on what's going on in Congress. I think I'm in day 60 now, and I've been telling folks it's 3 times as much work and 5 times as much fun as I expected. We get about 120 meeting requests a week right now, of which those are 15-minute slots, so 120 requests. And I think if I'm really cranking, I can accommodate 16 of those. So it's a lot of meeting requests, a lot of great committee hearings, and then what a tremendous time to be here in our nation's capital. It's such a critical time for our nation's history. Only 8 years. 8 years total since the Great Depression have Republicans controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House at the same time. And we just got a lot of important work to do, but it's a tremendously exciting time. So, it's just going really well, and we got a lot of work to do, and we're ready to do it.
Well, let me let people know if you have a question for Congressman Baumgartner. The question's open right there on the bottom of your screen. You'll see the Q&A box, and try to avoid using the chat because it's much easier for me to be able to use the Q&A function there. And then we'll get to that in just a moment. I did want to start the question process just by asking you, there's been a lot of talk about, attacks on Medicaid and attacks on Medicare. And, that's been kind of flooding social media. What's your response to that? And how are you seeing the challenges of Medicaid and Medicare? And how do you see Congress attacking those?
Sure. Well, we have to realize to start with that our nation is on an unsustainable spending path. $37 trillion in debt is a real problem. Debt payments now are taking more payments than our nation's military, and we cannot leave our country a broke country. I am not going to leave America bankrupt for our next generation. So the federal government has grown bloated and has a lot of unnecessary spending. And, it's kind of shocked that there's gambling in this establishment kind of scenario here where Republicans are trying to step forward and have thoughtful reforms of state spending or of government spending. And of course, anytime you touch any bit of that, the hard left will cry wolf and scream that cats and dogs are living together and these sort of things. So all we're trying to do in Medicaid is some simple Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich reforms to welfare spending that are common sense and the vast majority of the American people support if they can actually know what's going on. So, for example, Medicaid is an extremely problematic, from a financial perspective, system where state governments are incentivized to game the federal government, because if the state expands welfare Medicaid eligibility at the state level, they get more federal money. And they do so in some oftentimes mischievous and tricky ways when they do that. But what Republicans are actually trying to do are do things like, if you're a working age 27-year-old male, and right now you're sitting at home in your mom's basement playing video games and eating Cheetos and smoking marijuana, we want you off the couch and out in the labor force. And so that's the kind of things that we're trying to do. Nobody's trying to throw widows and orphans on the street when it comes to healthcare. We're trying to make modest reforms to state legislature. Some things we're trying to do, like Scott Walker, Washington Policy Center friend, he elected not to expand Medicaid in Wisconsin. So Wisconsin is a much better fiscal position today because he showed fiscal restraint and then what Washington State did, trying to take every single Medicaid dollar. In fact, when I was in the state legislature and I voted against Medicaid expansion, my exact words on the Senate floor, well, I said, from the state legislature, we cannot fix the dysfunction in Washington, D.C., but we should not be enabling it. Well, now I have an opportunity to fix some of the dysfunction in Washington, D.C., but there's a lot of scaremongering, these kind of things going on, but all we're trying to do is a combination of a little bit of what Scott Walker did in Wisconsin and a little bit of what Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich did in the mid-90s with welfare reform, and try to stop the growth of these programs moving forward. And they're good common sense measures. We'll see how far we get in those with our narrow majorities. But as none of your Washington Policy Center folks would be surprised, the truth of what we're trying to do is much more common sense than what gets portrayed in the media.
If you have a question for Congressman Baumgartner, the Q&A box is at the bottom of your screen. Type it and we'll get to it as soon as we can. This question is from Glenn. What do you expect from the State of the Union tonight?
So the State of the Union, I think the president is going to come in and speak very boldly about the agenda he was given by the American people on things like securing the southern border, unleashing American energy, and bringing inflation to heel. And I think he's going to tout a lot of successes in that sense. First and foremost, on the border, I think it was our number one issue of the election, our number one priority. If you don't have secure borders, you can't be a sovereign nation. And there's so much fentanyl that was flown into the country, killing Americans. Over 100,000 Americans killed last year from fentanyl. And we have seen under the Trump administration, in just these first weeks of the administration, illegal immigration has plummeted at the southern border, has reduced dramatically with the measures the president and the Congress have taken. So I think he's going to talk a lot about that. I think also he'll talk about what we're doing to unleash American energy. It is both essential for our national security and for our economy that we pump more American energy and all of the above energy population. I think he'll talk a lot about that. And then he's going to talk about some of the important cultural issues. The idea that we should have fairness in girls' sports by making sure that biological men are not allowed to compete in girls' sports. And he's going to talk about things like making English the official language and some of the other executive orders. Now, I came to Congress as an Article I guy. I believe the most important branch of government is the Congress, and we have a constitutional balance. And so it is important that everything the president is doing that's in the name of liberty and economic growth, we need to make sure that Congress is ratifying those things. So we have some catch-up work to do with the administration, but I think he'll be touting a very successful initial few weeks of him being president.
Here's another question from the audience. Where do you stand on the administration's back down from Russian cyber issues and the general reversal of the U.S.'s posture towards Russia?
Well, I have a background in national security. I was with the State Department. I have a lot of concerns about Russia It is very important for America that Russia not be successful in Ukraine, and that we avoid World War III. I do not want Russian troops on the Polish border. With that being said, I think the president does understand that very clearly has campaigned on bringing that war to an end. And the reality is that's going to require in negotiations some concessions for both the Russians and the Ukrainians. It's going to be, frankly, an unsatisfactory conclusion for both the Russians and the Ukrainians on the current status. And I think, he, as the executive branch commander in chief, is doing some things in his judgment to prepare negotiations, with the Russians. But still, let's remember it is President Trump that provided the Lancet rockets that could destroy Russian tanks before. While he was in office before Joe Biden, it is President Trump that did things like assassinate Iranian terrorist leader, Qasem Soleimani, where other administrations wouldn't. So I don't think President Trump is soft at all when it comes to foreign policy. I think he's trying to work with his administration to line up peace negotiations similar to other presidents trying to bring significant conflicts to an end.
This is a question from Tad. I live in Seattle. Does the congressman ever communicate with Congresswoman Jayapal?
In fact, I do. So when I was chair of the Commerce and Labor Committee in the Washington State Senate, Congressman Jayapal was then a freshman on my committee. And I remember her coming to my committee asking to get a bill out. And so Pramila and I have known each other for a while. We actually have diametrically opposed views on most things, but actually on a personal level get along pretty well. So as a joke, the other day, I was sitting in the Judiciary Committee, and Pramila was texting me as the debate was going back and forth in the Judiciary Committee. She was texting me saying that we should get together for dinner or a coffee, and sort of to bide the time, I sent a lengthy text message to her trying to recruit her to switch sides and become a Republican, very tongue-in-cheek. Back when she asked me for that first bill in the state Senate, I told her, sure, Pramila, there's a way to get your bill. And I tried to pitch her on switching and becoming a conservative Republican back then. So we were having a good time with that. But her policies, obviously are very bad for our state. But, I looked, President Trump got precisely 11% of the vote in Pramila Jayapal's Capitol Hill district. So the reality is her voters are very different than my voters. And I wish that was not the truth. I wish her voters were a lot more similar to my voters, but the reality is she's pretty in line with the folks on Capitol Hill.
Next question. There's been a proposal on the House side to slash certain taxes that are projecting to outpace any gains on spending that DOGE and other efforts are making. But what are we going to do to gain ground on the deficit? Shouldn't we at least be maintaining federal revenue to pay down the debt if we are cutting spending to get ahead?
Yeah, so there's some inside baseball here that I can explain to your policy center folks. I think are equipped enough on civics and policy to appreciate this. So to understand what's going on in Washington D.C., the first thing you have to understand is the Senate filibuster. So all of you probably know, being policy center folks, what is the magic code for a bill to become a law in the state of Washington. So if you want to turn an idea into a law in the state of Washington, you need 25 out of 49 votes in the Washington State Senate. You need 50 out of 98 votes in the House, and you need the governor. So the magic code for a bill to become a law is 25 plus 50 plus 1. So back when I was a champion of freedom for WPC, I used to wake up every day thinking about either how to go 25 plus 50 plus 1 or how to stop the 25 if we were trying to stop something, either as a committee chair. Now, if I were to give you all a pop quiz on what is the magic code in the U.S. Congress for a bill to become a law, each of you should know this, and if you don't, you should chastise yourself, because every American should know. So what's the magic? How many numbers do you need for an idea to become a law in the United States Congress? Well, there's 435 members of the House, so you need 218, and there's 100 members of the Senate, so you need how many? The answer is 60 because of the filibuster. We'll talk about it in a second. You need one president. So the magic code is 218 plus 60 plus 1. Right now, there are 53 Republican senators in the Senate. And the deal with the filibuster is that the founding fathers realized that human beings are flawed individuals, and the genius of the American system is they separated power out, and that they made it hard to pass laws by design. So not only did they create 2 chambers of the legislature, they put 9 guys in black robes to then decide whether something can actually last. But then within the Senate, they made it even harder because they have this filibuster rule. Now, as conservatives, we tend to like the filibuster because it empowers small states and it makes things harder. The challenge is we're out of constitutional balance right now. So my view of Washington, D.C. is more power should be at the state and local level, and that too much power within has gone to Washington, D.C., and then within Washington, D.C., too much power is in the bureaucracy. So how do you fix that issue? But on budget issues, you need to find ways to get to 60 votes. So everything has to be bipartisan except for one area, which is called budget reconciliation, and that's within the Senate. So the Senate could get rid of the filibuster tomorrow, but again, we as conservatives tend to like the filibuster being protected. So on this issue of the budget, in what's going to happen with debt, you saw in last week's vote to set the terms of budget reconciliation. And what is happening right now is in 2017, one of the signature accomplishments of the first Trump administration was that corporate and personal taxes were reduced. It was a supply side economic measure to try to make American corporate tax rates and personal rates more competitive the rest of the globe. Because of the Senate filibuster, which limits certain tax measures to only 10 years, half of that tax reduction will expire next year. And so if Republicans are in control, and if we do not take affirmative action to extend those tax cuts, Americans would get the largest tax increase in history while Republicans are in control. So that would be both problematic politically, and it wouldn't be good for our economy. At the same time, the way the Congressional Budget Office scores tax, and this is a tax extension of current taxes. Now, President Trump would like us to do even more tax reductions, some that I don't necessarily agree with personally or have challenges with, but President Trump did campaign on, for example, no taxes on tips. Well, that would add to the deficit. We think we've walked him back on no taxes on Social Security. That would be extremely challenging for the deficit. So you have President Trump, who did not campaign really very much at all on solving entitlements or budget issues, who wants to do a number of things that would further add to the budget. And this deficit issue with the taxes, the Republicans have a challenging point that either we do nothing and Americans get the largest tax increase in history, or we try to responsibly, within the vote margins that we have, extend those tax cuts and try to bend some of the cost curves on things like Medicaid spending in a way that can get 218 votes in the Senate and in the House, a majority of votes in the Senate. So it's a very challenging issue, and people like me that are fiscal conservatives are trying to work within a team environment with a House that is divided on fiscal issues and try to make responsible spending decisions with that environment. So it is a challenging situation, but we're not getting any hope at all from the Democrats. But I do believe that the budget measure that we passed, the framework that we passed last week on a party line vote, which was a very difficult party line vote that did take the president and the White House directly intervening. It looked like it was going to fail on the House floor. And so it took the White House and the president personally calling some of our members to hold that coalition together. And we set a framework that I think responsibly, given the numbers that we have, provides for increased border security, increased American energy production, responsibly starts to bend cost curves on bending and reduces some reckless spending, and then also tries to equip the American military for some of the challenges of dealing with China. So that's a long answer to say that the overall budget situation is not as fiscally conservative as I would like, but it is a reality of having the narrowest House majority in history. So we only have a 5-seat majority in the House. It's 220 to 215, and Matt Gaetz resigned and has not been replaced, so we're down a seat. And then we have 2 other Republicans from Florida have left and gone to the administration, and we're waiting on Elise Stefanik to leave. So the majority is really narrow, and the best thing for fiscal responsibility in this country would be if we could build the Republican majority, because it would give us some opportunity to do better on the fiscal concerns. That was a long answer, but it's a complicated one on the budget stuff.
I appreciate it. Next question is from a Mr. Matthews. How will increased tariffs impact the deficit? And is there any energy in Congress to contest the Trump tariff policy?
So I have a lot of concerns about the tariffs. I'm a Milton Friedman person type who realizes that, especially in a trade dependent state like Washington State, that tariffs can be inflationary and there can be a retaliatory issue there. And I'm not the only member. There's a lot of Republican members, and we're working intently behind the scenes on that issue. I just saw I've had 3 meetings with the Speaker of the House in the last 4 days. Obviously, President Trump campaigned on tariffs, and he very much likes tariffs as a negotiating tool. I think President Trump sincerely likes tariffs as an economic policy, and he likes it as a negotiating tool. When I read the U.S. Constitution, to me, tariffs as taxes are clearly an Article 1 responsibility. And I thought, how does the president even have the ability to impose tariffs unilaterally without Congress? Well, then I started researching, and in fact, Congress has granted that permission to the president. And one of the reasons Congress did that was because it used to be the most powerful members of Congress would keep tariffs high to protect industries within their districts. So Congress voted that power away, and for most of history has actually served to liberalize trade, having the president do it. But now there are some issues with that. In respect to how it would spend on the deficit, actually tariffs would be scored by the CBO as a tax and would bring in revenue. So it would score as reducing the deficit in our budget negotiations.
What was your overall reaction to the testy exchange between President Trump and Vice President Vance with Ukrainian President Zelensky? What was your take and your overall assessment of that?
Well, I thought it was very unfortunate. I am somebody that does not want to see Russia succeed in Ukraine and for American national security interests, but I was extremely disappointed in President Zelensky. I thought he handled that situation very poorly, and in fact, that was the 3rd time that they had been ready to sign an economic integration deal between the Ukrainians and the Americans. That I think, we're not going to give the Ukrainians an out-and-out security guarantee that would commit us to defending Ukraine in case of attack. If we were going to do that, we should just put them in the NATO, which I do not think is in America's national security interest. So the next best thing is to have an economic alliance which serves to integrate our economies. And I think it's a pretty innovative and strategic suggestion by President Trump. This was the 3rd time that deal was supposed to be signed, and it was Zelensky that wanted to have a public meeting. And to come into that meeting and instead of just signing the deal, saying thank you to the American people and moving on, he really caused a problem, because he's shown 3 times now the administration can't trust him and set up this entirely avoidable, public snafu. And if he wanted to have that argument in private, but then the proper way to do that would be, once the deal is going to be done, you come together and you sow zero space between you and the Russians, between America and Ukraine, to face the Russians. But to do that in public like that, I think was extremely detrimental. And so I'm very disappointed in President Zelensky, and as are a number of folks like me in Congress that have been supporters of defense of Ukraine. And so it was not a great day for what we're trying to accomplish in Eastern Europe. By the same token, America has a lot of challenges we have to face. We have Islamic terrorism, nuclear proliferation from Iran. We have China trying to replace America as the preeminent power on the globe. I mean, I'm on House Foreign Affairs, and I can't tell you how many challenges America has to face. And we need the Europeans to step up and do more. Even after 3 years of a serious war on their doorstep, almost no European countries are hitting their 2% target, on spending. And I think it was one of the European leaders that said, they can't, 500 million Europeans can't expect 300 million Americans to pay for their defense and protect them from 150 million Russians. And so Europeans need to spend a little less time in the techno clubs and a little less time in the cafes and get out of their early retirement social welfare state and start paying for their militaries and preparing for a multipolar, multi-threat world.
I noticed that's another 3-number category.
Yes. There you go.
Hey, I read in the Spokesman Review there was some Doge layoffs at Bonneville Power, or at maybe it was the Cooley Dam. Sorry, and there was the overall approach was, hey, Eastern Washington is being hit by these spending cuts. What's your overall response to that whole effort, and what would you say to coverage of that kind, where there's this, hey, there's these jobs that are being lost here, and this is a bad thing for Eastern Washington, is the implication.
I want a really good federal government workforce that works extremely hard and is valued. But the reality is that the workforce has become bloated. There is a lot of wasteful spending in the system, and to have someone like Elon Musk that can come in and bring an outside business perspective and a real hard look at government, I think it's overall a very positive thing. I wish they were being a little more elegant and a little more strategic in some of the things that they're doing, but I share their goal. So on issues like Bonneville Power, I've been very involved in making sure that we help get those folks we need back to spin turbines and do other things. Also, you can use the phrase you'd like them to have more of a scalpel than a sledgehammer, but the union rules that serve to protect federal workers also make it almost impossible to use a scalpel, because if you had more flexibility in those rules, they could be more strategic in that. So we need to have an innovative set of regulations in our workforce that allow innovation and downsizing, when necessary. Again, President Clinton came in and did a lot of the same things. Of course, it was a less partisan world back then. So I share the goal that to thin out the federal government workforce. And just a personal story, just to kind of bring this thing home to your viewers. Myself, as the newly elected member of Congress in Eastern Washington, I tried to get office space in the federal government building in downtown Spokane, where Maria Cantwell and Patty Murray have office space. And when I went in there in December, it was a ghost town. All the offices were empty because all the federal government employees, not all of them, but most of them, or many of them, were working from home. But even though there were empty office spaces, GSA was unable to functionally rent office space to a member of Congress on behalf of the public for which we serve. So while I have concerns about some of the federal employees, as far as I'm concerned, Elon and the guys can go as deep and hard as they can on GSA. It was dysfunctional. Now, of course, so we had to get office space outside the building. Well, Kathy McMorris Rogers' publicly owned furniture is sitting in a warehouse right now. Well, now I can't even get the furniture because whoever it is from GSA that technically has to deliver the furniture, isn't there. And we're like, guys, we will drive our own staff over with a truck and we'll just pick up the furniture ourselves. But no, they cannot handle that. So it's like it's a broken federal government system. So we do want good federal government workers, but if that is not a sign that the elected congressman can't even rent office space, and for any of you with commercial real estate, simple stuff like what would it take to paint the walls? What if we needed to do minor cosmetic changes or move a power outlet that a commercial private sector space would do as a course of business? The federal government is unable to do those things right now. They told us it would be probably 2 years for minor cosmetic changes in a empty federal government building. Okay, it is broken, folks. And so we got to fix it. And so, for all the stories and about this person get let go, we're trying to figure out how to fix this broken system.
Tell us about your legislative priorities for your district.
Eastern Washington, is a fantastic district, and it's, rightly perceived as one of the stronger districts in the country. Certainly you have the Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, George Nethercutt, rose to a very prominent position in appropriations, and Kathy McMorris Rogers, of course, had one fantastic career and became chair of Energy and Commerce, one of the most powerful committees in Congress. And so I come in with big shoes to fill and a good reputation for Eastern Washington. We should have more Republicans than we do in the state of Washington. We're the 13th largest country state by population, one of the most richest states, and a wonderful state. We all know how wonderful Washington State is. We were drawn to have 4 Republican congressional districts. Right now, we only have 2, and it's kind of crazy that arguably, I may be the highest profile Republican now in the state of Washington. Interestingly, President Trump won Eastern Washington by 8%. I won my election by 21%. So compared to presidential baseline, we were actually one of the top performing Republican campaigns in the country, in a state that was the worst performing state for Republicans in the country. So we did things right in our campaign, and I think that's because people of Eastern Washington know me, and I think they believe in the things that we represent and that we're trying to do. But for our district, the border security is a huge issue. I went to the border last spring, and before I went down there, I talked to law enforcement all across our district. The fentanyl scourge is real, even in Eastern Washington, and because of the ridiculous behavior of Olympia in the state legislature, Washington State has become a drug superhighway because drug enforcement has become so lax. The fentanyl comes up into central Washington, and then before it goes to the Great Plains, it goes out. And so Olympia has made our drug problem worse in that sense. So that's a huge issue. Our federal dams are extremely important. We have a lot of wheat in Eastern Washington, and almost all of it needs to go down to the Snake River and get out through those dams to the ports. We need to protect those dams. Our largest employer in Eastern Washington is Fairchild Air Force Base. That's one of the reasons I'm pleased to be on Foreign Affairs Committee, because it is such a geopolitically strategic issue. And then I'm trying to do some things on higher education, which are important as well too. So I actually had the first bill to pass out of committee in the 119th Congress. That is a bill called the Deterrent Act, which will bring more sunshine and transparency to Chinese influence on college campuses. So I was very proud to get that bill out. We'll be working that bill in the Senate. Actually, the day after I got that bill out of committee, I had the president of Harvard University in my office, and we had a little discussion about how higher education, elite higher education, has lost trust with the American people for some of the woke stuff they've done. We talked about how to get that back on track, how places like Harvard need to take steps to make sure they have political viewpoint diversity, and that they have lost trust with not just the American people, but that conservatives don't feel comfortable on their campuses, and asking Harvard what they were going to do to step forward. And I suggested that self-implementing my bill would be a good step towards that. So those are a few things that we're working on, and certainly more to come on all those issues as well.
Well, allow me to remind people, I believe it was your bill that made Washington State's tuition not rise for state colleges. You were the one that basically stepped forward as a state senator and said, hey, here's an idea to stop tuition increases. Let's say they can't raise tuition.
Yeah, and the federal government, and what's happened is the federal government has flooded student loan dollars into high school students. The problem with an 18-year-old is they don't know the difference between $600 in debt or $60,000 in debt, because they've never had a job and how to pay it back. And most of that money has been sucked up in a one-for-one basis into the higher education bureaucracy and all these DEI deans and all this kind of stuff. So we need to right-size college education and make sure that it's affordable again, and that it's teaching stuff that are relevant to the job market.
Final question for you, because I know you got to prep for the State of the Union address you'll be watching. But I did want to know, and you alluded to it a little bit earlier, which is how has your experience in Congress changed your perception? You mentioned being on Foreign Affairs and saying, hey, look, I have a foreign policy background, but we have some significant threats ahead of us. Just in those terms, or in economic terms, or in any terms that you'd like to set, how has your experience so far changed your perception or your expectations of where we are as a nation or as a state?
No, I'm just really optimistic about the future. I mean, and I said that, cognizant of all the challenges that we have, but America is still this wonderful republic. It's the shiny city on the hill. I'm finding from my colleagues, I love working with Jim Jordan on the Judiciary Committee. I was very pleased to be on that committee with him, and I see the effort that folks like Jim Jordan are putting through. Mike Johnson is a man of tremendous high character in an extremely difficult position. And, really what I found in Congress are a lot of well-meaning folks that care deeply about our country, and this is not an easy job. I know it's popular in general to think poorly of Congress, but it's not an easy job, and I just appreciate the opportunity to fight for Eastern Washington, fight for the entire state, and I have every confidence in the world. I mean, the reason I am here is those 5 kids that I get to kiss at bed at night before I wake up early in the morning and get on the plane to come out here, and I'm just not going to allow them to lose the opportunity at the wonderful America that you and I know and love. And so we are going to keep this republic, and we are going to make sure that our fiscal house gets in order, and we are going to make sure our military gets modernized to face the threat of China and Islamic terrorism, and we are going to roll back all this regulations so that we can finally build stuff again in America, and we're going to protect the American dream for the next generation. So, after day 60, I think my biggest takeaway, I'm just more optimistic about the future of America, and it's just an honor to be able to position to work for that.
Well, Congressman, thanks so much for your kind words about Washington Policy Center, and for joining us to answer questions from the audience, joining us again, I should say, to answer questions from our audience and our members here. And thank you for spending time with us on this very busy day.
Yeah, thank you. And everybody from back home is certainly welcome to come out and visit me in DC. And I hope to be able to join you either at the annual dinner or some other function. And, just don't give up the fight. We need Washington Policy Center more than ever. And those of us that believe in the free market, we're not going to give up on our state or our country. We're going to fight back, and we'll win this thing. So thanks so much. And hopefully I can join you. We can do this again sooner rather than later. Take care, guys.
Thank you, sir. Good to talk to you.